mobile telephone, respecting the indigenous peoples to have their own means of communication and their own networks, and that results in a virtuous circle of empowering with training and promoting the local economies. There's also a lot of progress in satellite technologies. We are eager to see the low orbit satellites more inexpensive, because paying 20 pesos or $1 for per hour for connectivity is not affordable to most people. So therefore, those are the big challenges in the region to do away with inequality. The new paradigms, the access to the spectrum, new maps, visibilizing places that are not connected, and where is the infrastructure, the backhaul infrastructure necessary to promote the last mile traffic. We'd like to see a redesign of this universal bandwidth with new paradigms, supporting women in the technical training to operate networks, and also using the internet for connectivity, education, and health, and promote, and these funds should also promote the creation, or should encourage, new local providers with or without, with profit or non-profit, to promote the orange economy and the creators of apps, services, local contents, multilinguistic contents, promoting the preservation of culture and languages in the region. Our indigenous peoples, we are in debt with them, respecting the defense of the territory, their self-determination, and the right to auto-communicate. New paradigms too, and with this I'm done. More agile ways of licensing, agile and simple licenses. If we are going to speak of regulatory, we have to promote regulations to experience connectivities, free use spectrum, community networks, cooperatives, mesh networks that may promote the proliferation of many new players. Not all of them have to scale up to a global economy. There are subsistence, livelihood economies, and global economies. We have a whole range, and all of them need connectivity for their development and preservation. And finally, our new paradigms of connectivity should respect the personal data. There shouldn't be, starting in the 21st century, we shouldn't have something such as the digital extractivism.
Sin duda, son muchos los factores que influyen en la inclusión digital.
Thank you very much. Many stakeholders have to do with digital inclusion, and it's important to have flexible and inclusive conditions in order to advance with this goal. The participation of the private sector for providing access has been of fundamental importance over the past decade. However, the response provided so far is insufficient in order to advance in digital inclusion. With us, we have Sergio Valdes, leader on external affairs of AT&T. Sergio would like to count on your standpoint on what has been stated and on the response expected from the private sector to face the current challenges. You have the floor. Good morning, everyone. I'm trying to activate the video. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of AT&T DirecTV, I'd like to thank you for your invitation, and my wonderful colleagues in this panel. I'd also like to thank them for allowing me to join them in this space. I would like to start mentioning some of the challenges Colombia has regarding digital inclusion. We have 62 40% of people who can only access internet in Colombia. In other words, almost half of the population has no access to the internet. From these connections, the rural population, in other words, people who don't live in the cities, only 21% access and 58% of the population in urban areas. In terms of education, public institutions in Colombia, 85% of all public education institutions, 44,000 centers, have no access at all to internet connection. For rural areas, only 8% has connection to the internet. This is for schools, and 43% in urban areas. In other words, these numbers show that Colombia has major challenges in terms of internet connection in urban and in rural areas, and also in schools. What have public policies done in this regard? And this is in recent months, and this is one of the questions asked to the panel in order to improve and change these discouraging numbers. Well, many things have been done from the standpoint of AT&T and DirecTV. First of all, the law for modernization of the state was voted. Among other things, this expands the licenses for spectrum of up to 20 years, the obligation of operators taking infrastructure to distant areas in an adequate way as part of their obligations with the state. The regulatory rate was also unified until this law was voted last year. There was a large variety of regulatory rates. Internet providers paid a regulatory rate. The content providers paid a different rate, which was higher. So this led to inequalities or a lack of symmetries in the market that were now corrected with this law. Additionally, there was an obligation of smart regulation to be implemented by all stakeholders of the value chain, both public and private. In addition to this, the National Development Plan was issued with a very big digital component. The National Development Plan for Colombia is a roadmap that establishes the fact that public entities have to undergo digital transformation at a very large scale. Important resources of the national budget were allocated with this aim in order to bring about the digital transformation. In addition to this, the regulatory authorities and the inspection authorities as a MINTIC and other entities established criteria for smart regulation. What do we call smart regulation? Well, this is a regulation that promotes competition, promotes investment, and promotes legal certainty. Based on this smart regulation, regulations have been issued to deepen the relationship between users and companies in terms of the request and response to claims. Criteria and incentives were established for deploying infrastructure, as well as criteria for improving quality issues for providing such services. Let me highlight here an issue of great importance, namely that many of these changes in public policies are the result of Colombia entering the OECD. We are now at the stage of the connectivity indicators and so on required by OECD. But Colombia has now entered this best practices club, so that the public stakeholders that develop public policies now have to adopt these practices and also to establish criteria for cost benefits. And regulation is one of the important things that are taken into account. which are the challenges that we still need to follow this path? We have to continue working a lot on legal certainty. At present, Colombia, in terms of audiovisual content, has a scourge which is piracy and informality. In Colombia, at present, 4.1 million households receive an audiovisual service which is illegal, or they receive it illegally. We need about 1.5, there are 1.5 million websites visited every month. These are piracy sites. This leads to a major loss for the state in terms of lack of taxes. 8,400 jobs are lost every year as a result of this, and this also affects the creativity and culture of the country. The pandemic has pointed out that there are some issues that we did not see in the past, and this is a lack of digital culture. Many people who access the internet in Colombia do not know what to look up in the internet, how to look it up, and how to take advantage of the potential of the internet. So this is also an issue that, in addition to the legal certainty that I mentioned earlier on, have to be dealt with the state, from AT&T and DirecTV and the other associations which we belong to, including ACET. We are working hand in hand with the government and with the state in general to enhance these skills of the population and of the new workers so that we can improve digital inclusion. These are challenges that Colombia is facing, but we consider that the state and the government is taking adequate steps in order to close this gap and in order to achieve digital inclusion of more citizens in Colombia. This is a task that is in progress now, and we believe we are on the right path. The public and the private sectors are working hand in hand in order to achieve these goals. I would like to stop here now, and later on, when we are in the Q&A session, I could add on
Muchísimas
more
gracias,
things.
Sergio.
Thank you, Valeria.
Bueno,
Thank
por
you,
otro
Sergio.
lado, la armonización de regulación es sin duda uno de los
On the other
factores
hand, the
determinantes, no
harmonization of
solamente para el intercambio de
regulations is
experiencias,
one of the
sino para la
determining
cooperación y
factors,
para la
not only for
coordinación
the
entre
exchange
los
of
países de la
experiences, but also
región.
for cooperation and
Tenemos en
coordination
el panel a Allan
between the countries
Ruiz,
of the
secretario
region,
ejecutivo de la
is
Comisión
the
Técnica
topic that
Regional
will
de
be
Telecomunicaciones
shared with
COMTELCA.
us by Allan
Allan,
Ruiz, who
por
works on the
favor,
technical division
cuéntanos qué ha
of
pasado en los meses
telecommunications,
más
COMTELCA.
recientes
Alan, could
en
you
el
tell us
ámbito
what
de la
has happened in
armonización
recent months
regulatoria y qué
in the
efectos
field
ha
of
tenido para la inclusión digital?
regulation and
Nos contamos
harmonization,
contigo,
and what
entonces.
effects have been these for digital inclusion? Thank you very much, Valeria. And I'd like to thank the organizers of this event for the invitation. On behalf of the board of COMTELCA, I'd like to thank you for having included us in this panel. I'd also like to greet the previous speakers. This allows us to continue with this topic. And this is also a challenge for me so that I don't repeat many of the valuable contributions mentioned. Now, when this pandemic began, well, let's speak about the good things. There is a fear that there is an overload of the network, and we took some measures to solve this, and we assisted the sector, but fortunately the networks were quite resilient. There was a change in the load in the households, but somehow this was solved, and at present we really were able to face this situation. And this is positive. It was also positive that many of us had the opportunity of working and studying and producing from our own homes. We could continue also with issues such as entertainment, etc. Now, it turns out that this also reflects issues of inequalities. not all the population has equal access to this. Sergio gave us some of the statistics in Colombia, and it is likely that this is the case in other parts of Latin America. He also mentioned that the rural and urban areas have different situations. Now, if we were to correlate this effect with the vulnerability and poverty and extreme poverty, we would realize that there is a strong bias when accessing digital technologies. As a result, a large part of the population does not have access to these rights. Like Adriana was saying, these are rights to education, to health, and to work. We therefore see that from the standpoint of what we are doing, there are issues that we were already aware of, but has now become more serious. And even in some places where there is some connectivity, that connectivity is not significant, so that in those households, all the activities can be carried out, the activities that we mentioned earlier. On the other hand, the crisis has somehow driven the spending in this area. So the idea is we face enormous challenges. There is a population that is not connected, and part of the population that is connected is not very well connected. And then what we spend for this service has also decreased. In other words, from the standpoint of regulatory and public policies, we are now facing a new world. We now have to be audacious. We have to be innovative in the sense of how we will view the regulatory frameworks and public policies. We have mentioned this on several occasions. This is an ecosystem. Imagine this would be like a fishbowl where we have to maintain it in a healthy condition, and those who manage public policies and are in charge of regulations have the obligation of maintaining that ecosystem. So many of the actions arise, many of the actions that we already mentioned. Regulators nowadays have to provide legal certainty to investments. This was already mentioned. They also have to facilitate the development of infrastructure. We have to bear in mind that the costs have to drop considerably. So we have to be very nimble when we manage resources like the radioelectric spectrum. We have to be to the point when we embark on issues such as sharing infrastructure. We also have to be clear about the fact that public policy has to drive access. And as was mentioned earlier, this access has a fully different meaning, because this will be, for some cases, the only window to be able to access our own rights.
So today, access needs to be seen from a point of view of the public policy, should be cross-sectional, including all the sectors, maybe prioritizing education and health, so that, and having a decent work, decent jobs, and probably for many of our peoples, we also have to focus on citizen security and safety. We need to bear all this in time, and from COMTELCA, we have worked at this in recent months. Today, our guidelines, thanks to with the support of LACNIC, they helped us develop guidelines for the countries to implement IPv6 guideline. And we also have another guideline to use for a sound use and certain use of infrastructure. We are also working on electric spectrum And we are starting some issues, including all our current working plans with the COVID vision. We see that connectivity today should meet the needs that maybe were the same before the pandemic, but now have a great sense of community. We can't wait long before we make the changes. It is clear that the institutionality today concerning the development of digital technologies needs to be a much more robust institutionality. All of the previous speakers have mentioned the issue of capacities, and indeed, one of our plans, one of the axes is training, qualification. Today we have a very important partner, an ally that is SEABAC, with whom we've had a huge opportunity to train the staff of our institutions. And today we are adopting the working plan for future years to meet the needs of people. As to the regulatory issues, we've seen that the regulatory changes that were mentioned by Sergio when he spoke. He mentioned having a smarter regulation, and countries are working at that. And those are elements that need to be borne in mind when making this change. We also understand that some efforts of public policy has been focused in the institutions that are in charge of digitalization. However, today this has become obsolete, because in order to create those systems, we need tables with multi-stakeholder discussions. That is why I'm so happy about this event that we are holding today, because we have many players that have a lot to contribute with when we in the digitalization process.
Nos juega en contra.
You just have a few minutes. Yes, to conclude, basically the topics are focused, and we're trying to see new perspective given what we suffered these months. Thank you.
Gracias,
Thank you.
Alan, sin duda,
Thanks
los
a lot,
desafíos de la
Alan.
era
There's no doubt
prepandémica
that
se han
the challenge of
complejizado,
the
demandan de
pre-pandemic,
adaptación y de
the pre-pandemic
respuestas
challenges
creativas en
have
colaboración, como has
made
mencionado.
become even more important.
Por otro lado, la Comisión
On the other
Económica
hand,
para
the
América Latina,
Economic
la
Commission
CEPAL,
for
ha sido
Latin
importante, ha
America,
sido
ECLAC,
puntual
has
en la
been
región
important.
para
They
analizar
have
los
been a
desafíos alrededor de
stronghold
varios
in the
aspectos
region to
relativos a la
focus on many
inclusión
of the
digital en el marco
challenges,
de la pandemia, pero
including
también
digital
más allá de él,
inclusion
ha generado propuestas en la
within the
línea de
pandemic and
garantizar
beyond.
el
And there are
acceso a las
new
tecnologías
proposals for
digitales
the
para
access
enfrentar
to
los impactos de
digital
esta situación que estamos
technologies to face
viviendo,
the
¿no? La
impact
emergencia
of the
sanitaria.
current
Y
situation
está con
of health
nosotros Sebastián Rovira,
emergency. So
oficial
we
a
have
cargo de la
Sebastián
Unidad de
Rovira,
Innovación y de Nuevas
who
Tecnologías de la
will be in
institución.
charge who is in
Sebastián,
charge of the new
quisiera pedirte que
technology.
nos cuentes
Sebastián, I wanted
brevemente
to
los
ask you
aspectos
to
más
please
relevantes
brief
que han
us on the
resultado
most
del
relevant
análisis de la
topics that
situación
have
actual en la
resulted from the
región
analysis
y
of the
las
current
respuestas que
situation in the
propone.
region and the
Tienes la palabra.
responses viewed. Hello, good morning, Valeria. Thank you for the invitation to speak in a LAC IGF. It's a pleasure to be here, to be able to share my view with you. I'm going to present, or I'm going to tell you about some of the topics that have arisen in the latest studies that we presented it a month ago. That speaks of the relevance and the links between the need of ensuring access to digital technologies to see how we face and how we respond to the pandemic and the crisis posed by COVID. There's no doubt that although it's been said throughout the session that the economic and social impact is very important. ECLAC has defined some numbers to this economic and social impact. And in the case of Latin America, we are facing one of the worst crises, if not the worst crisis in the last 100 years in the region. Think that the GDP will drop by 9.1%. Exports will drop by 23%. It is foreseen that more than 2.7 million MSEs will go out of business, and with an increase of poverty of over 45 million people. What this tells us is that it highlights the potential impact of the digital technologies in this conflict. There is no doubt that it is greater than people were aware of. But the potential impact of digital technologies need to be seen in the light of the reality in the region. The region poses or has a number of structural constraints. And so the impact of COVID gets expanded, or it worsens the gaps that were just mentioned. And these structural constraints have to do, first of all, in the access and connectivity. And that are things that we are going to address. The network speed that still has a lot of room for improvement, a gap in the digital skills that is very relevant, and finally the productive processes that are a comprehensive part of the to see how we can improve in the digital inclusion and reduce the digital divide. So in view of these structural constraints, we see that there's we are risking an increase in the divides related to the digital technologies. Sergio just mentioned some numbers in Colombia. When we see it across the region, we still have 1/3 of the people that make a very limited use or even no use of the internet. 33% of the households in the urban areas still have no access, and 77% of the rural areas don't have access. So these are very concerning, very worrisome figures. And we know that from the point of view of the age groups, we have a lot of disparity. 42% of people younger than 25 are not having access, and 54% of the people older than 63 don't have access yet. So there are many differences with respect to geographic location and age group differences and income quintiles. There we see very significant differences in countries like El Salvador or Bolivia. That is, the first or second quintiles are just 3% of income, or just 3%. So sometimes we look at the general view, the forest, and we don't see any problems. When we look at each tree, there are many problems. And speaking of connectivity, we still have 40 million households that have no connection. And of those 40 million, more than half belong to the first and second income quintiles. And the connectivity is also an issue. Laura mentioned this. It's not just a matter of access. The broad band recommendations of the UN requires a cost lower than 2% of the people's incomes. And when we see the people with the lowest incomes, the first quintile, in the case of the region, but of course there are very significant differences, we are still at an affordability that it goes as high as 12% of fixed broadband and 14% of the mobile phones, 14% of the income of people. So that's a very serious problem when thinking of the usefulness of the digital technologies, such as e-health, e-work, e-working, e-commerce. So when we think of all this, we need to consider the cost and the affordability. And finally, quality is an unsolved issue. Although in the first months of the pandemic, it seemed that there was a huge pressure on the networks, really, there was quite a quick and successful response, so the good service was maintained. Yet, we still identify, and somebody mentioned it this morning, is that when we need to use different services at the same time, and they imply using a lot of data, there we run into trouble. We have connectivity problems, and only 33% of the countries would be able to use 2 apps using a lot of data in addition to the basic usage. So there we have an important element. And in that regard, one of the things that I was telling you about a month ago, ECLAC proposed working on the creation of a basic digital basket, incorporating not just the funding or the access to connectivity, to the internet connections, but also how we can provide the devices people need to use this service. So in that regard, this estimate, we estimate that we would need, for this basic digital basket, we would need 1% of the GDP. This is an average of the Latin American countries. Of course, there are differences, huge differences with countries like Bolivia or El Salvador. That would be about 10% of the GDP. But in countries like Chile and Uruguay, the percentage would be very low because the number of people that are not connected are very few. Still, we are just speaking of connectivity. But if we think of the skills people need to develop to know how to use connections in a productive manner, that's another matter that would be, it would be very important to see how we could
Sebastián,
improve that.
tienes menos de un minuto.
You have less than 1 minute. Yes, I'm wrapping up. Another thing that we said precisely, well, we were thinking of how we can make the best use of resources and seeing how we can increase the regulatory flexibility. This is another issue that would enable people to have access to education. And for that purpose, for instance, because precisely we should think of what happens at the level of education. We still have over 32 million children that are not having e-learning. So after the pandemic, our society will be much more polarized with more inequalities. So we need to use the ICTs to reduce that divide instead of increasing it. Thank you, Sebastián. Thank you.
Sebastián, es fascinante escuchar. Qué
Thank
lástima
you,
que el tiempo nos
Sebastián.
juegue en contra y que no
It's a
podemos
pity
profundizar
that
en
we are so
propuestas tan
short of time, because
interesantes.
it would be
Con tu
wonderful to
intervención terminamos
discuss this more
el primer
in depth.
segmento
It
de la
was very
sesión.
interesting.
Entiendo
So
que
with
vamos
this,
a hacer un
we are
receso de 5
closing this
minutos.
session.
Si
Now
es que
we
lo
have
pueden
a
confirmar, por
5-minute
favor, desde
break.
la
Could you
Secretaría.
please confirm it
Decir
at the
que
Secretariat?
22:15
So
UTC regresamos
it's
para el segundo segmento de la sesión.
12:15 in
Gracias con todas y con
Uruguay.
todos y nos
It's
vemos en 5 minutos.
so we'll close for 5 minutes. 5-minute break. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Valeria. I want to thank all the members of this first panel. So we have a short break, and in 5 minutes, we'll go on with the second segment. Thank you.